Hi there, and welcome to Off the Data Provided, an interpersonal communication podcast. I'm, of course, your host, Dr. Marcus C. Shepard. On today's episode, we're going to talk through a book I recently read entitled Reclaiming Conversation, The Power of Talk in the Digital Age by Sherry Turkle. This book is about 10 years old, but still as vital and important as ever in today as we further cocoon into Web 2 and 3.0 technologies. Throughout our discussion, it's going to be important to think and consider such terms as fubbing, conversation, solitude, of course, self-reflection. We will talk, of course, about punctuation, as we have before, this concept of whole person conversation, surveillance, paradox of choice, maximizers, satisficers, as well as multitasking, unitasking, deep reading, intellectual serendipity, and last and importantly not least, strong ties and weak ties. Usually, at the end, we have an Ask Dr. Shepard, but because I believe this is going to be a rather long conversation, I'm going to just save that for our next episode. Of course, if you would like to submit an Ask Dr. Shepard, feel free to email me at offthedataprovided@gmail.com. Once again, that is offthedataprovided@gmail.com. So delving into the thesis of reclaiming conversation. Essentially, there's this feeling that we all are encountering where we feel as if no one is listening to us, and that plays a large part in our relationship and engagement with technology. We're forever elsewhere, this concept that she talks about, where we aren't ever fully present in our offline real-world engagements. We often find ourselves maybe bored or desiring a constant feed of information, connection, or entertainment. So even when we're with people, we have our phones out or we're checking our phones. And I myself am guilty of this. I would argue probably the majority, if not all of us listeners, are guilty of doing this at one time or another. But I also am very aware that there was an era and time before when I didn't do this. And I would probably argue, depending on your age, you also didn't do this. So we have to be honest and open with ourselves to realize that our phones are a psychologically potent device that change what we do, how we do it, and who we are. And this is by design. So this book looks at how we are shifting away from communication in person and face-to-face, how we are having this flight from conversations, how we are becoming more and more isolated. So we might feel more and more connected, but with these online connections, we unfortunately are feeling more alone, more isolated. And so while you might have an increase of connection, it almost seems as if you have less community. And this, unfortunately, is by design. And then they try and sell us technology that fills in those blanks that have come in by design. So, of course, this book is 10 years old, but it still kind of predicts where we are starting with AI. And we've talked about artificial intelligence before and how people are creating these modes, these apps, these technologies to kind of fill in for, oh, well, people are lonely. Well, let's create an app that they can talk to, that they can share their feelings with. Well, that doesn't necessarily make them feel less alone. It might make them feel connected in that moment. But then when they stop talking to this AI that really can't engage, the AI isn't having a life of its own. It's computer programming. It's a bunch of ones and zeros automated to give you a certain response, or it can search and figure out what you want. And ideally, as we've talked about before, it wants to keep you on the platform as long as possible. So it's going to tell you what you want. It's not going to maybe say something you don't want. It shifts how we interact. It shifts how we expect people to react, right? We're always looking for the quote unquote right or best answer. And that's not what human connection and activity are. humanity, we're messy. We're incongruent at times. We're filled with complexity. We're filled with ideas that are incongruent at times. And that's not what the AI is going to give you. And that then is not going to be potentially what you expect. So this is kind of the groundwork that the book starts off with. And one term that really stuck out to me, maybe it's dating myself, I'm not aware of, is fubbing. And so this is the concept of maintaining eye contact even while you're texting. And I know I'm guilty of this. I can literally be talking to someone, looking them in their eyes, but because I've typed enough on my iPhone at this point, I kind of know where the words are, right? So I can be engaging. I can hopefully, quote unquote, be multitasking, talking to someone face to face while also texting somebody else. But to be fair, I'm really not that present, potentially. So we know that these computers, right, they're offering an illusion of companionship without the demands that we think of interpersonal relationships. And their programs are really, really good. And so they're giving this companionship or illusion of companionship without the demands of maybe what we call friendships. And the illusion of friendships really without the demand of intimacy. So we're spending more time texting. We're losing more time face to face. We're losing the practice of the empathetic arts, right? Learning how to make eye contact, to listen, to attend to others. Communication, especially conversation face to face, is a path towards experiences of intimacy, community, and communion. So the holidays have just wrapped up, right? Happy New Year to all the listeners if you're listening to this when this episode has dropped. And I don't know about you, but I was around people. And so I hosted a Christmas Eve spectacular, I would call it. We'll see if my friends who attended would agree or not. But I had about 9 people there. And I know whenever I host people at my house, well, first and foremost, they all have to take a rapid COVID test because, Dr. Shepard doesn't play about that. And so once people were in the clear, we were able to have great conversations. And when I'm hosting people, my phone kind of disappears. I don't know where it is. And anybody who has been around me for long enough, right? If I'm hosting and people are there, oftentimes, especially if I've been cooking, right? My phone might be in the kitchen. It might be on the couch. It might be on the kitchen island. I don't know. And I'm guilty oftentimes of hitting my Apple Watch to do the ding, ding, ding. Where's my phone, right? To help me find it. Because when I'm around people, I try and engage in conversation. And so that means my phone is not important. My phone is not going to be that lifeline that it is oftentimes when I'm at work, when I'm at the gym, when I might be in other social settings. I've been guilty before. If a movie is pretty bad, I'll check my phone, right? If I'm at the movie theater. And so we're seeing that without these conversations that people have, we are seeing that people are becoming less empathetic, less connected, less creative, and less fulfilled. And so whenever I usually host events of that magnitude where I get a bunch of people together, there's food, there's great conversation, people's phones aren't as readily out or available, I will often get words from people that they felt whole, they felt renewed, refreshed. And that is because of the art of conversation. We are lacking that in a lot of our relationships. I know I'm guilty. I can recall a time in particular. I invited a friend over to watch a movie on Amazon Prime, and we were watching it, but we both kind of had our phones out. The movie wasn't that engaging, so we were kind of offline talking to each other, but also at the same time engaging with people who weren't there. And so we weren't present. And that sticks out to me because I'm usually, when I am with friends, especially friends I haven't seen in a while, I am more present. But I recall that this friend kind of had his phone out first. So I kind of felt the reactionary need. Okay, well, let me have my phone out as well. And so we know that when phones are just out in general, and the book argues and cites several studies, that when phones are just out on the plain sight, that our depth of conversation decreases. We're not going to have those soul soul-bearing, searching conversations. Or even if we do try to have those, we might not go as in depth. The person might try and be present, but their ability to be present is going to be mitigated by their alleged ability to multitask. And we know that multitasking from numerous studies is not really a thing. Yes, you can do multiple things, but you're going to suffer at doing those multiple things. So we slip into a thinking that we're always connected because of these phones, because of these social media platforms. And this is going to make us less lonely. But in reality, we're lonely because, yes, we're connected with people. These mobile devices, these smart computers, they grant us these different wishes, but we feel connected, we feel heard. We feel as if people are paying attention to us. We feel as if we'll never be alone, therefore we'll never be bored. But ultimately, we do feel lonely. We don't feel as if we are as quote unquote connected as we could be. Sure, we have a connection, but do we have community? Do we have true companionship, true friendship? And so I oftentimes think about my students who are, of course, younger than me on average, and who have more so grown up in the smartphone era, that their relationships kind of lack a presence and lack a connection that I know some of my closest and deepest friendships still have. When I last saw Dr. Anderson, who will hopefully be on the podcast this year, we had great soul-bearing conversations. My phone was in another room. Her phone was in another room, right? We didn't even notice that we didn't have our phones because we were connecting, we were talking, we were giving unfiltered responses, as we always do, right? That quote unquote kitchen table talk. We were focused on what the other person was saying, what they also weren't saying, maybe with body language, maybe with eye contact or not eye contact, the rate, the pitch of their voice. Those are things you can easily notice when you're not distracted by a phone. So we know that people with phones make themselves feel less vulnerable to each other and feel less connected to each other than those who talk without the presence of the phone on the landscape. So I felt very connected with Dr. Anderson. Or when I have had other friends here, right? One of my best friends, Darius, spent a whole week with me essentially around Thanksgiving. And yes, there were times when his phone was out and my phone was out as well. But there were also times when they weren't out and we were having really deep and meaningful connections. And so reading through this book and through some of her theories, I was able to apply it even to my own lived experience. And I think some of you would be able to as well. And I think we can all recognize that we are probably less vulnerable and less connected when our phones are out than when they're away, when they're not around at all. And so that brings out, when we invest in communication, we're getting a payoff of self-knowledge, of empathy, and experience of community. And that goes back to, as I said before, the messages that I've received from people. Every time, usually when I host events, I'll get a side message that, oh my God, I feel so renewed, I feel so whole, I feel so connected. Well, it's because of the art of conversation that unfortunately we slowly but surely are lacking due to our lack of presence, due to these smart devices that we have around us. So we're moving from conversation to mere connection. Once again, I'll say that. We're moving from conversation just to mere connection. We're avoiding those face-to-face conversations when we're confronted with them, maybe. We want to talk via email or text, right? So I'm a professor. At the kind of beginning of being a professor, people would somewhat come to office hours, but would definitely prefer email. Now I can honestly not recall a time someone came to my office hours. It's been well over 5-6 years since someone came to my physical office hours, right? Students prefer to meet via Zoom and or ideally email, right? They will send me a detailed, almost a page-long email and just want my responses, right? We're moving away from conversation just to mere connection. And when we move from conversation to connection, we're truly shortchanging ourselves, right? Conversations teach us patience. They allow us to learn new things about people. As we've talked about before, this cognitive complexity theory, where when you engage with multiple people, if you have high cognitive complexity, you realize that you can't engage with everybody the same way, right? Everybody is unique and different. I've used examples before where Dr. Anderson, Janine, right? Our friendship is straight no chaser. I just spit it out. I say what I want to say. She does the same, vice versa. Where my primo Jaime, right? I need to butter him up a little bit if what I want to say. I need to ease into it. But I know that because of the countless years of conversations that we've had. We're not just connected. We are a community because of the years-long conversations. So tweets, right? Sips of connection, let's call them tweets or social media posts or longer form videos. They don't really truly add up to conversation. But unfortunately, a lot of people, and especially the younger generation, are using those in place of conversations. So we want to be mindful also that in this new communication culture, interruption is not experienced as an interruption, but just as another connection. So perfect example, when my friend was over watching the Netflix movie that wasn't so good, so I won't tell you what it was, we were interrupting ourselves with the text messages we were sending other people or the tweets we were sending out about the movie we were watching at the same time, right? We were being connected to people who weren't even physically there while not being as connected with each other because we weren't having an uninterrupted conversation. And we know that from sharing online, right, there's this idea of I shared, therefore I am, where we share our thoughts and feelings in order to feel whole, but we don't know who we are potentially because we're turning to others to support our sense of selves. And so the author argues that through solitude and self-reflection is truly where you learn a true sense of self. And you do that ideally not with a phone. You self-reflect in your own silence. But because of the new communication culture that we're in, silence, downtime, me time is always you're just on your phone. You're scrolling, you're searching, you're hopping between different apps. So we're getting this illusion of companionship without the demands of friendship, as I've said before. And so this illusion of progress also without the demands of action, right? We're feeling as if we're creating and fostering these relationships without anything really happening. And so we're using technology to solve problems that maybe aren't even problems in the first place. People avoid the spontaneity of conversation. They're caught up in a culture of expectations of getting everything right because of the communication culture of the digital sphere, where we know that things are permanent. Whatever you tweet out, whatever you write out, even if you delete it, right? Someone could have screenshotted it or done a web browser history to bring back maybe a post you posted, right? So whatever you post is forever out there. And so we know that people are starting to edit themselves. And so when you're caught in the editing of yourself online and then maybe offline, that really impacts how you potentially can view yourself. So as I said before, right, solitude and self-reflection are going to be really important and is something that a lot of people struggle with. So solitude is essentially just the state of a conscious retreat, a gathering of self. And because you know who you are, you can see others then for who they are and not necessarily who you need them to be or even who you want them to be. So solitude really helps you have richer conversations, but our current communication climate, right, with the digital sphere kind of undermines this capacity for solitude because if I'm feeling down, if I'm feeling bored, instead of sitting with that feeling, instead of working through that, instead of maybe doing some creative thinking, some daydreaming, right? When's the last time you daydreamed? I don't know. You go to your phone. You go, and I know I'm guilty of it at times, right? I'm going between text, email, Instagram, Twitter, and back again. Oh, did I get a new notification? Oh, let me refresh my feed. Let me see. Right? So I'm never unconnected. I'm never sitting with myself in that way. So solitude is when you become comfortable with yourself. And if you are comfortable with yourself, you can put yourself in someone else's place, in their shoes, see something from their perspective. This is where we are gaining empathy. And so unfortunately, in this current communication digital climate, we mistake time on the internet for solitude sometimes, but it's not, right? You're like, oh, well, I'm by myself, I'm just browsing. But solitude is a challenge to our habits to turn our screens off, right? And so instead of turning inward, we're turning to our screens. So, how can we learn about ourselves? And unfortunately, for the younger generation, especially children who are growing up in this time, when are they alone with their thoughts? When are they alone with their feelings? When are they allowed to explore their imagination? If children always have something outside of themselves to respond to, right, their smartphone, then they don't build up these resources. So it's not really surprising today that a lot of young people get very anxious when they don't have their phones. So I know dating myself a bit, but I remember not having a phone. I also remember when I had a phone, but I shared it with my older brother, right? Depending on where he was, where I was, right? Depending on where we were. Okay, you would get the phone or I get the phone. And back then, the phones weren't smartphones. They literally were to call our parents, and you could limitedly text, right? This was when you could text people for free after a certain hour, or you had a certain amount of text. But texting really was just to set up plans. So with these smartphones, right, it's clear, right? If a child grows up with this phone, they've always had it. If they don't have it, they get anxious. Where I know there have been times that I was guilty, not so much anymore because I have an Apple Watch and I like to monitor my steps, so my watch is connected to my phone. But there would be times where I would forget my phone at home, where I was rushing, and I would kind of have to go my whole day without it. And of course, the first maybe like 20 minutes or so, once you realize you don't have your phone, it's tough. But I also grew up in a world without a phone, so I was able to detach. And so what I have done the last kind of year or so is there are certain hours where I'm just not on my phone, where I can focus on other things, just listen to music, read a book, fully focus on watching a movie or a TV show. Maybe I just sit in my bed and journal. This is important to do, right? Solitude is that capacity to connect with yourself. And when you connect with yourself, you can connect with other people. And so the process of checking our phones, though, draws us further into the process, I think, if you know, as I know, into checking your phone, right? So as I said before, right, I'm guilty of, okay, let me check my texts, let me respond to those. Oh, let me check some email. All right, let me go to Twitter, let me go to Instagram. Oh, wait, did I just get a new text? Let me go back, right? And it's just a cycle and a cycle and a cycle. And I know I'm not the only one where you're on your phone and then you look up and it's been an hour or two and you're like, well, whoa, where'd the time go? Because these devices are designed to keep our attention. And so with that, you're not going to have solitude and you're not going to have self-reflection. So the apps can give you a number, right? They can tell you how many people like something that you said, or maybe comments are going negative. They can tell you that. And technology can expose the mechanisms, but people provide you with the meaning. People provide you with the narrative. So I remember I had a viral tweet, I want to say roughly 2 years ago. We've talked about it before. Got several million impressions. And because I know myself, because I have solitude, because I have self-reflection, right? When the narrative started to maybe go bad, when the app's numbers started to go bad, when the majority of the comments started to turn negative, I didn't internalize it because I knew that my message reached who it needed to reach, right? The first 24 hours or so was all very positive. And now people were just taking it out of context. And I remember a friend called me and he was like, are you okay? Like, I saw this thing you want, they're talking really negative. I know that's not who you are. Like, the narrative they're trying to spread or the meaning they're trying to find is negative. And I said, no, it's fine. Like, I wouldn't waste your time engaging with these people. I've engaged with a few of them. If people truly want to learn and understand, they can. But it's not going to rile me up. I'm not going to lose sleep over this, right? And so I had self-reflected, right? Self-reflection makes us vulnerable. It helps us to think about, well, what do these things truly mean to me? What do these things mean to other people? What is this truly saying about me? And because I had done that work, this huge moment didn't mess me up, especially when it went negative. Versus maybe I would argue a decade prior to that, if that same thing happened, I probably would have been losing sleep. I probably would have been impacted and affected by it. But I wasn't, because I knew who I was, because I have these times to sit in solitude and think about my life, because I have times and mechanisms designed for self-reflection. And what's interesting about social media and when it comes to self-reflection, we know that people use the web for self-reflection. And so the real question is then, how truthful do you really want to be? Because we know that it's not a private space. It's not a journal. It's not your diary. It's a public space where we're expected to be quote unquote real and vulnerable. But social media encourages us to play by a certain types of rules. You're supposed to reflect and you're supposed to share. So you share as you reflect and you reflect as you share. But these companies who are providing you the platform keep it all. There's no privacy. You kind of post at what cost? And we are doing a performativity of self-reflection sometimes. We are performing in a way that we would hopefully want to attract positive views, to attract positive comments, to attract sympathy. And so we all know that social media is just a fragment of who we are, but it still makes it appear as if we're really getting something out of it when maybe we're not. It's a connection, but is it truly community? And I don't think social media is all bad. I think there are great things, as I've shared before. Two of my best friends have come literally from Twitter. We moved those conversations, those connections offline, and those connections and turned into community. But what happens when you don't move any of these connections offline? What happens when you keep them online? When you are doing a presentation of self that maybe is a bit inauthentic because you've been raised to present yourself in a certain way that gets likes, that gets engagement in a certain way. And so is that truly who you are, or is that who you are trying to purport yourself to be and able to be liked? And those are things for us to all consider. We also know that when it comes to these conversations just in general, the concept of punctuation is going to be really important. So punctuation, as we've talked about before, is kind of when something begins and ends. And with social media, that becomes a lot harder to figure out, as we've discussed before. But also punctuation in the literal sense as well. In texting, punctuation means everything. Every period, comment, exclamation point, ellipses, emoticon, it all shapes how someone might read what you have typed. And so if you don't know the rules or you make the wrong assumption, your meaningful, quote unquote, connection could go away or stop when it comes to texting. And so I know in terms of online dating, right, sometimes it's pool by committee, right? And I know that some of my friends have reached out to me, oh, I want to send this type of message. What should I say? Or I know I've been guilty. I want to send this message to somebody. Does this sound right? Is this too overly this way or that way? And so we're feigning over punctuation that we might not be so obsessed with if we were having these conversations face to face. So punctuation becomes vitally important. Did I use the right emoji? Did someone misread this emoji? If you're just getting to know someone and you send an emoji and they misinterpret it as the book has outlined, well, maybe now they just don't engage with you anymore, right? They take what you said a way in which you didn't. And if you were communicating with them face to face, you could easily course correct in a second. But now you're left on blank, or you're blocked, or you're unmatched, or you're muted. And so now you don't know what you did wrong, and you can't really fix this relationship. And that highlights how a lot of these quote unquote connections online are only as good as your last engagement or message. And that's not necessarily the case with relationships offline, right? I've gotten in dust-ups, I've gotten in arguments, I've gotten in disagreements with very close friends, but we had a bedrock of support. And so while we might have gotten in a dust-up face-to-face, we let a few minutes go by, we come back, we try and figure it out. Well, online, if I barely know you and you say something I don't like, you're blocked, you're muted, you're deleted. Okay, how is that connection similar to the connection offline, right? It goes back to this whole point about we're kind of trading out our friendships, our community, for just mere connections, right? We're moving away from conversations to mere connections. And one of these kind of terms that the author used was whole person conversation. And the author said, in quote, if things go quite quiet for a while, you look deeper. You don't look away or text another friend. You try and read your friends in a different way. Perhaps you look into their faces or attend to their body language, or you allow for silence. Perhaps we talk about conversations being quote unquote boring, such as a frequent complaint we are saying how uncomfortable we are with stillness and how hard we find it to quote unquote read the face and voice, changes in body language and changes in tone. So with the whole person conversation, this is being attuned to both the verbal, what someone says, as well as the nonverbal, what they don't say, what their paralinguistic cues are saying, what their body language is saying, what their eye contact is saying, what their hand movements are saying, what their tone is part of them paralinguistic cues, right? If they're fidgeting around, if they're disengaged, right? If I ask someone how they're doing and they say, I'm fine in text, okay, I have to take them kind of at their word. If I ask them how they're doing in person, we're having a whole person conversation and they say that they're fine, but they kind of look down and they say it the following, I'm fine. They sound a little exhausted. They sound maybe a little upset. Okay, let me probe a little more. But via text, they say they're fine. Okay, let me move on. So we need to hopefully get back to whole person conversations. And so we know that when we are talking versus how we are texting, right? When you text, you can kind of confine yourself to consolation text. If you are upset, maybe you got a bad breakup and you text a bunch of friends that you got a bad breakup, they're going to send you well wishes and you can engage with them or not engage with them. If someone probes you a little bit and you don't feel like talking about it, you can disregard them. Where in person, if you open up about a breakup that you had with somebody, they're probably going to ask questions. They might push you to think about things in a way that maybe you hadn't thought about. Maybe they ask you, well, how do you think the other person is taking it? And the spontaneity of conversation is vital for who we are as humans. But unfortunately, people are afraid of that spontaneity of communication because we have been taught that there is quote unquote a right way to communicate, right? We are taught that there is a certain way we should quote unquote broadcast. So social media has definitely taught different lessons to people. It promotes this idea of broadcasting to people in an effective way to get them to like you, to get them to follow you, to get them to retweet you, to do all of these things. Instead of where communication in terms of a conversation in person usually teaches us and rewards vulnerability through being sincere, through making eye contact, through being fully present, and in turn, the other party hopefully is as well. But, and this shocked me from the book, and maybe some of you have done this, maybe not, but texting about issues you have with people. So I was unfamiliar that people seem to do this on large scales, but the author talks about a family who in particular text about issues that they have. And so instead of having a family meeting or talking face to face or maybe over the phone, what they do instead is they go directly to text or email to put forth the quote unquote right message out. They don't want, to say something in the heat of the moment, the spontaneity of communication that might rub somebody the wrong way. But when we do this, when we say that there's a right message to let out, it sets an expectation that there's a right message to receive back. And it implies that when you talk to people, that there's only one right way for things to go. But we know that relationships are messy, they're untidy. And when we try to clean them up with technology, we don't necessarily do them justice and we lose connection. So I know for myself, when I've had personal issues, I usually try and talk to them with people on the phone if I can't talk to them face to face. And there has been one familial relationship that I guess I have where that hasn't been an option, and the texting didn't work either. So we just don't have a relationship, right? Because I'm not going to chase somebody down to talk to them, right? I've reached out to them on multiple occasions and have been met with kind of silence, or met with them trying to play victim and not engage. And so if that's what that person wants to do, then I let them do that. But I know that in order to fix anything, you have to talk about it. You have to talk it through. You can't just text back and forth about it, or quote unquote edit what you say before you say it, or expect them to say something a certain way. That's not humanity. That's not any type of interpersonal relationship. And those definitely aren't the relationships I'm looking to have, especially at this time in my life. So what we know, unfortunately, is through all of this, we are being inundated with connections. We're deciding how we want to connect or who we want to connect with. And therefore, ultimately, maybe feeling tired, right? You're always connected. When are you going to have a moment of silence? Okay, I'm not going to talk to anybody, but I'm going to surf my phone. When are you just still? When are you having solitude? When are you having time to self-reflect? And this also appears, of course, in the dating field, right? With romance. And as I previewed or talked about before, right? Sometimes conversations are done by trial, right? Of friends, right? You send what you're going to say to a friend and see what they think. So you're not even maybe showing up as your quote unquote sincere self, right? You're showing up as a representative, right? Chris Rock has famously talked about first dates, how usually we don't send ourselves, but we send our representatives, right? The best self of who we are. But over time, our representative can't do that job. So we start showing up as who we are. And that's where we figure out if the relationship will work or it doesn't. But in the digital sphere, right, this danger is that we can just continually keep sending our representative. So it's hard to know if it's working out or if we're actually making a genuine connection. Because the goal of romance, especially in the digital sphere, is about efficiency and control. That's what all of these apps are offering you. They're offering you this idea that if you spend X amount of time swiping, or you pay a premium, we'll show you these great people, right? Okay, it's within your control, depending on how much time you spend, how much money you spend, and we can streamline the process for you. But romance is not really something that is about efficiency and control. It takes time to know somebody. It takes time to deepen those connections. We've talked about before, self-disclosure. You just don't delve into deep self-disclosures 2 seconds into meeting someone. But if we're trapped on these apps, as we've talked about before, you're just continually sending your representative. You're continually putting your best foot forward. And then on the flip side, when it comes to empathy, you feel less empathetic because this is just somebody on the other side of the screen. You don't really know who they are. So you might not be mindful or watch what they say. So I know the Pop the Balloon show, right, is something that's popular. And I remember someone sharing with me that they had messaged someone and all they sent back, they kind of just were like, hey, how are you, to somebody on one of these apps. And the person just sent back a balloon with a pin, right? Basically being like, I'm not interested in you. How rude is that, right? You could literally just say, hey, I'm not interested. Or I guess the term, the nothing gambit, right? Where you just don't respond, right? Where you just don't respond to someone. That's been normalized online, right? I remember when I first kind of got online on some of these apps, when I was, single and looking or whatever, that, someone emailed and I would just be like, hey, I'm not interested. No, thank you, right? And sometimes that person would try and keep talking, right? Or other times they would respect it, right? But that was kind of how I would engage, right? And so therefore I would respect or expect if I messaged someone, they would respond in kind. But I soon realized, right, that nothing gambit where the conversation resolved at all, right? It's hasn't trailed off like in person-to-person conversation. Maybe you pick it up online. We kind of give ourselves the permission to behave that way, just to cut people off, just to not respond. Oh, I don't feel like talking to them. I'm not interested. I'm just not going to say anything. Well, if someone approached you in the real world, quote unquote, right? Offline and said, "Hey, how are you? I think you're attractive, right? I'd love to get to know you," right? You wouldn't just turn back around and ignore them. You would probably say, "No, thank you. I'm not interested," right? Or some type of pleasantry. But online, we've kind of given ourselves this permission to not be empathetic, to realize that it still does take guts to approach somebody and not know what they're doing. And in similar thing with romance and kind of these connections, we're faced with this paradox of choice, right? We're going to be super happy with all these endless choices, but then we never usually make a choice. And these people who never really make a choice are maximizers, right? They're somewhat like perfectionists. They need to be assured that what they are getting is the best possible thing that they could get. And so it creates this daunting task where they keep increasing the amount of options. And when we see that on social media, especially, right, enter Tinder, enter Facebook, enter Hinge, enter any of these things. When you enter in a world where you can fantasize about the infinite possibilities, you're encouraged to develop this maximizer approach where I'm going to find the best thing, the best thing, the best thing. And you never really do. And you feel exhausted, you feel tired, and you never feel whole. You never feel happy because you're always looking for the best. Where there are satisficers, and these people, you still have standards, but you're not haunted by the possibility of choices. You make a choice, you're happy with it, and you make the most of it. And so we know from different research that satisficers are generally happier because their life tasks are simpler. So of course you still have your choices when you go into dating. As I've always shared with people, you should have your shall not rules. You should have things that are non-negotiables for you. But outside of that, be open. But if you come in thinking, I want to find someone with the best smile, the best body, the best hair, smells great, has this type of job, well, you might meet someone who accomplishes a lot of that, but could I meet somebody who makes even more money? Could I meet somebody who's even taller? Could I meet someone who cooks even better, right? And being obsessed with that, then you're never fully engaging. You're never fully making that choice. And so that becomes really difficult to break through and break free from. I know a lot of my students have struggled with this when we talk about dating in my interpersonal communication course, is that they're kind of forever trying to find the best thing, the best thing. And because of that, they're letting a lot of great things in front of them, which they could build into the best thing, go away or disappear, or not investing what is required to foster those connections. So that was kind of something that I agree with, something I think a lot of us has probably experienced. And then, of course, as I teased before, multitasking, unitasking, we all think, right, that we can multitask, that our brains are able to do two things at once, but we know from different research that our brains are actually just moving quickly from one thing to the next, and our performance degrades for each new task that we add to the mix. So sure, can I watch TV and cook something? 100%. And I do that often. But usually what I'm watching is not something I need to fully follow. So I'll put on Beyond the Gates, right? Love that show, right? It moves very slow. I can kind of check in and out. If a friend calls me, maybe I pause the show. Maybe if it's the Beyond the Gates, right, I'll take the call and talk, right? But I'm multitasking. But now my friend really wants to talk about something deep. Okay, I probably need to pause the show while I'm still cooking, right? Or okay, if it's something really intricate with the cooking, but they really need my attention, okay, let me turn the burner down to low or turn it off, right? Until I can resume. And so the book calls for unitasking, right? Where we focus fully, undividedly on one thing. But unfortunately, our lives are not set up like that because of our smartphones, because of our laptops. It takes a greater intention to just unitask. And I know when I'm writing something, when I really want to focus on grading, I unitask, right? I put my phone on silent, my notifications are shut off, and I'm fully focused on my task at hand. And that is something that I think is really important for us to think about and consider, and brings us somewhat to intellectual serendipity. And so this is what happens when you're working with people, right? When you're in conversation with people. And it may happen when someone tells a joke, or you daydream and come back to an idea. You go in a new direction. And none of this is necessarily efficient, but some of our best ideas, some of our strongest ideas, some of the most innovative ideas come from conversations that take these turns. And so when I always teach team and group communication, I talk about intellectual serendipity with my students and creative thinking and how it's important. Sometimes you just start the meeting, you talk about how's your day? What have you been doing? What TV shows have you been watching, right? And then you move in to the task at hand, but allow for that free flowing of information, allow for that spontaneous communication to take you on different tangents, because these tangents might work back in to what you are doing or what you are thinking about. So we know that, yes, technology can be super helpful. It can make us be productive, but it can also take us away from intellectual serendipity, right? If you have that meeting on Zoom, you're probably going to be just focused on accomplishing the task at hand. If you're having the meeting via Google Doc or via text or any other place where you don't have to fully be present in the face-to-face, you're probably going to lose out on some of this. And so that then brings us, of course, to the context of weak ties and strong ties, right? So strong ties, of course, people you trust, likely to have a long history of face-to-face conversations with, where weak ties we know of usually as friends of friends or casual acquaintances. But weak ties are also kind of the conversations we have online, and these draw on the power of weak ties. You don't necessarily know your quote-unquote mutuals that well, but we get caught in this connection with people we have weak ties with, while unfortunately, while we're maybe face-to-face with these people we have strong ties with, we're not fully present, and we are degrading a bit of our ties. So we need to be mindful and aware of that. And digital communication can, of course, as we've said before, but I really want to highlight, can make us lead to editing our lives. And we should not forget that an unedited life is also worth living and also worth not documenting. So I know some of my greatest times and greatest memories are ones I don't have pictures of. I am forever, talking with Kiara about how we rarely have pictures together, because when we are together, we are present more times than not, right? Sure, she might be on her phone a little bit. I might be on my phone a little bit. But usually when we are together, we are fully present. We are talking. We're not, oh, let's take a picture. Let's take a picture. The last picture we have is literally because I was like, oh, you're about to leave here? Oh, wait, let's take a picture to document that we were all together on Thanksgiving, right? Like, I just want to have that, right? But if I didn't say that, we wouldn't have that picture. And sure, I mean, it's a picture I love, and maybe it won't be one I look at in a few years, but I have those memories because we are fully present. And so it's important to live an unedited life and to figure out ways to do that. So, of course, Reclaiming Conversations gives several guidelines on how to do this, and I think I'll just share a few. I think the book is really worth reading, as I said before, even though it is, quote unquote, a little dated in terms of the majority of the book was written in about in 2015, and we are now in 2026. Woo! It still really applies to what we're going through, because unfortunately we're on this path of digital communication, and it is becoming a larger part of our lives. And it doesn't mean that it's a bad thing, as the book even underscores, right? We shouldn't think of it in binary thinking, it's good or it's bad. There are definitely some positive things that we can gather from it, but there are also, unfortunately, some negative consequences of it, right? That lack of empathy, that lack of connection offline, that lack of communication offline, the increase of connection to the detriment of having community, right? We are forever elsewhere, as the author has said, right? We have this illusion of friendship or this illusion of companionship, but we really are just having mere connection. We've moved from conversation to the efficiencies of connections online. And so when we think about all of that, first and foremost, it's important to remember that our phones are these psychologically potent devices that change how, what, and who we are, how we do things, what we think about, and who we are. They're designed that way. They're designed to keep us on them. They're designed to keep us away from people offline. They're designed to literally keep us on these phones so we're not elsewhere. We're forever elsewhere on the phone when we're in the real world. So it's important to, one, remember that. and give yourself grace. It's not that you are weak. It's not that, oh my God, I'm addicted. These phones were designed for us to become addicted to them. So once you can acknowledge that you are maybe quote unquote addicted to the phone, well, now let's figure out ways that I can become less addicted. So another way to do that is slow down. Find time for solitude. Find time for self-reflection. I know for me personally, when it's days that I don't work, I like to wake up early and I like to lay in my bed. I don't even touch my phone. I like to lay in my bed. I like to relax. I like to think about things. I might daydream a little bit. That's my moment to just be me, right? My phone is still on do not disturb. So maybe there are some text messages, email, social media things. I don't see them. They haven't hit me, right? My watch, even though I sleep with it, right? I have it on the sleep thing. So I don't get any notifications, right? It's important to slow down. Third is to protect your creativity by taking time and taking quiet time, right? I do that as well with my slowing down. We also want to make sacred spaces for conversation. So I know I'm fortunate enough how I grew up is that sacred space for conversation was dinner every night. So my mom would cook dinner more times than not, right? Usually Pizza Friday, we'd order pizza, right? But outside of that, every other meal kind of was home cooked and we would all eat together. So sometimes my brother would have practice that would run late, right? But we wouldn't eat. We would eat when all of us could be around, right? And if my dad was out of town, he wouldn't be there. But when he was in town and he was working, we wouldn't have dinner until came back home. And during that time, the TV wasn't on, right? It was designed for us to just communicate. And so it's important, I think, for us to get back to that. Where are spaces where we can just have conversation? Where are phones down, phones away spaces? Put your phone on silent so you don't even get the notification so you can focus and be fully present. One of the reasons we know why people aren't quote unquote fully present is because of this idea of the emergency, right? I always have to be available to someone in case there's an emergency. But think to yourself, how many times has there actually been an emergency? It's probably not that many times, right? So what is the harm in carving out some time in your day? Maybe start small once a week and build yourself up to 2, 3, 4, and then every day have this time where it's a sacred space just for conversation. No multitasking of I'll be on the phone but also texting, or I'll be with a friend but also on social media. No, find that time. We also want to move to unitasking. So we know that multitasking comes with its own high, right? Our brain craves that fast, unpredictable hit of doing new things. And it's a vulnerability we have as humans. But unless we design our lives and the technologies to work around it, we kind of resign ourselves to this diminished performance where we're not going to be fully present either way. It's also going to be important to talk to people with whom you don't agree. And so we know that with our over-reliance of social media, of just the internet in general, we kind of have become siloed in these echo chambers where we kind of only see and engage with people who agree with us. And so I know purposely I follow some people who I don't agree with. It's important to hear them out. I still don't maybe agree with them, but is there some commonality or common ground we can figure out and maybe work towards a solution? But because of the filter bubbles that we found ourselves in, where I only see messages that are congruent with what I believe and what my morals are, how's that going to work? Right? So I know I've gone viral the last few weeks around COVID posts, right? Because I am a COVID informed, COVID conscious, air aware, whatever you want to call it, person. And there are people sometimes who respond and clearly don't believe what I believe, right? Even though what I believe is backed by science and data, right? And so I'll engage with some of these people, right? But sometimes it's clear that they're bots, right? So I just block them, or that they have an agenda where they're not trying to genuinely talk, right? So someone's like, oh, well, there was a study that showed that masks aren't effective. I said, oh, would you please provide the study, right? I've read studies from as recent as 2025 that show that they're extremely effective, and I'd be willing to provide those if you can provide me your study. No providing of study, right? Or, oh, well, I know people who work in healthcare and they say that, okay, well, have they read this literature? Oh, well, they're doctors, they're RNs, they don't take it seriously, so I'm not going to either. Okay, right? So you're not trying to even engage. Cool. The author also talks about we should have those difficult conversations. And that's important. A lot of times people push these difficult conversations to emails or to texts, but to actually have them, to work through them. And I know, I've been having some difficult conversations starting to with some family members, right? And as I said, even before we had them, right? Conflict is the position in where I can show you that I love and care about you. And so if you run from the conflict, you show me personally that you don't really care about me, or you're not really invested in building community and maintaining it with me. If I've done something that offended you, or you did something that offended me, right, I need to tell you about it. I just shouldn't hold it against you. And so I think that's something people need to work with. And of course, lastly, right, this is just several of them, right? There are several I haven't talked about because I think it is important that you read this book, is that we should avoid the all or nothing thinking, right? That something is purely great or purely bad, or this works or it doesn't work, where we know from life, right? Life is complex. We know that nothing is ever truly great and nothing is ever truly bad, usually. So we should remove that binary thinking from how we approach communication, how we approach digital age, how we approach, quote unquote, face-to-face conversations, and figure out what works best. So does an email work best here? Does a text work best here? Does a face-to-face conversation work best here? FaceTime, phone call, what works best here and why? And really think about that. Why is it that I prefer this modality of communication? Why is it that I dislike this version? Why is it that I want to do it this way with this person, but a different way with this person? I think it's really important to have those self-reflexive conversations. And the only way you're going to really get there is if we get off of our smartphones, if we get off of these devices that have tethered us to mere connections away from actual community. So I think the book does a really good job underscoring what is at stake, showing that this younger generation, unfortunately, has been negatively impacted by the technology. Of course, the book offers that there are some positives that this technology has provided spaces to explore their own identities, to connect with like-minded individuals who they might not have ever found depending on where they live, has given people who are more introverted spaces to express themselves. But how can we figure out how to also understand that empathy is down because of online, right? You're just a name, you're just somebody, so I'm going to say whatever I want, right? If you actually knew that person, would you still say that same thing? And I would argue probably not. And I've experienced that with people who have attacked me, right? They say mean, vicious, vile things to me, but because I've done the self-reflexive work, well, it doesn't land because you don't know who I am. So, okay, sure, you called me fat. I am fat. Okay, what next, right? Like, what are you going to say? Okay, you're saying things about my identity that are what my identity is. Is that supposed to make me feel bad? Okay, maybe if I was younger and a child, it might, because I have not fully formed, but as an adult, it doesn't work. Those personal attacks. But also, if you saw me in person and we were having a conversation, would you really make those type of personal attacks? 9 times out of 10, we know the answer is no. So we want to be mindful and aware of some of the harm that's really coming. And a lot of that harm is lack of empathy, but also just the lack of ability to have conversations. And so this is where my interpersonal communication course comes in, and where a lot of students kind of share that they're actually here to learn these skills. And I think it's really important that we end this podcast today talking about that these are skills, right? These are things that you can learn. They're things that all of us had to do. So in order to reclaim conversation, we have to acknowledge that speaking and listening with attention are skills. They can be taught. They can be improved upon. And so if you're realizing through this podcast episode that maybe I am guilty of doing some of these things that maybe aren't as great for my communication, if I want to be more ethical and effective with my communication. Okay, we've acknowledged the problem. Let's figure out what skills I'm lacking, or maybe I'm using these skills in an ineffective way, and do some self-reflection and figure out how to do better. I know for me personally, from reading the book, I said, you know what? Sometimes I am really guilty. People call me because people call me a lot and seek advice. Sometimes I'm guilty of multitasking when they're looking for advice. And you know what? Moving forward, I'm going to do a conscious effort of, if I am doing something and someone calls and they're seeking advice, if it's something that I can't stop doing, I'm going to let them know. Or if it is something I can stop doing, I'm just going to stop doing it. right? So I know for me personally, right, it pushed me to think and consider that. And as I've always shared, we all are always trying to improve our communication, right? I study communication. I have a terminal degree in communication. I am somewhat expert in interpersonal communication and rhetoric, but I can always improve, right? I can always get better. Nobody is 100% in communication. I think we can all just strive to be a little bit better, a little bit better. And if we can realize that and understand that, give grace and empathy to people, then hopefully we can improve the art of conversation. We can reclaim it and make it our own. So that is the episode for today. Thank you so much for listening, and I will hopefully catch you on the next one.